All right, guys. Let me know if you can hear me. If you can hear me, like put something in the chat so I know that you can actually hear me. It's if you don't know where the chat is, it's up like at the top corner. If you can hear me, just put something in there so I know that you can. All right, perfect, great. So I'm just gonna basically put the PowerPoint up on the screen and just kind of go through it. And this is just the normal one that I would do in class. It's also the same thing if it's the same thing that's on the Nearpod, except it doesn't have the questions on it. So we'll go through this, and it's recorded, so yeah, other people can watch it later. If you have questions while I go through stuff, if it's really something that you need to know, just put it in the chat and I'll try to answer it. But other than that, should be all right. So the thing that this lesson is all about is just the conflict that's going on between the North and the South as it depends on like actual slavery. So hopefully you can see this PowerPoint. Go ahead and tell me if you can. I want to make sure that it's all working. Like when I just had it up, could you see it? Like, can you see this PowerPoint right now? I guess. Okay, perfect. Okay. So essentially, the thing that's going on here is that the North and the South are having different viewpoints about how they develop the way that they live. So the economies in the North and the South have been developed differently since all the way back in colonial times. The North had more industry, they had more commerce, they had those factories, they had railroads, they had canals, they had a lot of ways to move things from different locations. The South relied primarily on plantations and farming, and at that time, if they're doing that, they are required to use slaves as a way to work those farms. So these economic differences really begin to take each area into different directions. The North is going to definitely separate themselves from slavery, and the South is going to become more dependent on it. So the industries in the North attracted a lot of immigrants because they needed people in those factories, and since there were jobs there, the immigrants went to the cities to fill those jobs. As that happened, cities started to get overcrowded, and because the cities in the North got too crowded, people began to leave there and move to the Midwest, where kind of we are now in Missouri. Those people in the Midwest had to be connected to the people back north, not only to move themselves back and forth, but to move goods, move anything that they wanted to sell. So canals, which are like riverways that are man-made to connect places, and then railroads, they need to connect those regions. Those things allow people to make money off of things that are not slavery based. So in the North, you see abolition groups. Abolition, if you remember, is essentially just they want to ban slavery. In the North, a lot of people start to believe that slavery is immoral and it should be banned. Not everybody in the North wanted to ban slavery, though. Some people in the North wanted to keep slavery going, or they wanted to, they worried that if slavery was banned, that all of those slaves would now then need jobs, and then they would come into the factories and they would work for less money, and then they would replace the people that were already working in the factories. So there were some people that were like, slavery is just not right and it should not exist. And then there were other people that were worried that if slavery did go away, then the slaves, the African Americans that were previously enslaved, they would then be coming in and taking jobs from the people that were already working in the factories. In the South, it's a very different situation. In the South, a small group of people at the very top have the most amount of money. Slave owners get a lot of profit off of their business because they don't have to pay employees. Most of the cotton that they grow is sold to New England and British factories. Contrary to popular belief, in the South, most people didn't own slaves. They actually, they still supported the idea of slavery, but most people in the South were very poor. And in order to own slaves, you had to have money already. So you had to have money to get slaves. You had to get slaves to make a large amount of crops, and you had to have those large amount of crops to make more money. So the more money you had, the more slaves you had, the more crops you grew, the more money you got, the more slaves you bought, the more crops you grew. And then, so basically the rich get richer and the poor stay poor. But the poor still support the idea of slavery because they feel like, well, one day when I am actually wealthy enough, I'll have enough money, and then I'll get my own slaves, and then I'll have a huge plantation, which really wasn't very reasonable, but they still supported the idea of slavery because they thought, oh, maybe one day I'll get really wealthy off of it. Slaveholders argued that they were helping the less fortunate. They were helping these Africans by shipping them over to America 1,000 miles away from their homes and families, and then forcing them to work forever until they died, which, you know, is simply not true. Yeah, they gave them food, they gave them clothing, and they gave them shelter, but all of those things were very lacking in actual substance, and just the general life of a slave was terrible. So one thing I need to show you is this paper, right? This piece of paper right here. So this first one right here that says Missouri Compromise 1820. This is what we are dealing with before we get all of this territory in gray. Essentially, the Missouri Compromise declared that Maine would be a free state, Missouri would be a slave state, and then everything south of Missouri's bottom border would be slave. So if you just like extend this line out, so all of this would be slave, all of this would be free up here. Now, the issue with this is that when the Missouri Compromise is actually put into place, the gray stuff doesn't belong to us. So now what we see is after the Mexican-American War, things start to get a little bit more controversial in this area, because now we have all of this land, and the Missouri Compromise isn't really agreed upon anymore. One thing that was set out was the Wilmot Proviso. It attempted to ban slavery in all of the Mexican Cession. So that's all of the area that we get after the Mexican-American War, which is essentially, if you just want to look at this map, it's all of this stuff in gray. So they're basically saying all of this stuff, except for Texas, all of this stuff would be free area, no slavery allowed, which does not make pro-slavery people very happy. It passes in the House of Representatives, which is the first step, but then it also has to pass the Senate, which it fails. The Wilmot Proviso leads to a group of people saying, you know, we should not have slavery in this area. So they form a new political party, like we have the Republicans and the Democrats. Well, then we also have another party called the Free Soil Party. So this is just kind of a different looking map. It's not very good, so don't look at it. The Free Soil Party was dedicated to stopping slavery. Their slogan is free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. So essentially they just say everything should be no slavery. They wanted to make a national law, and they bring it to the national attention of they do start actually winning seats in Congress. They start to make some kind of traction, and the Free Soil Party really gets slavery into this issue of no need to have, they don't want to have slavery, they want to ban it. With new lands of the Mexican Cession, Northerners and Southerners feared that what would happen would be if the balance is thrown off. So you have, let's say, if you look at this map again, let's say that all of these stuff in gray, all of them become new states. Well, now there's 15 new states up here and only 3 in the slave part. So now it's upset. So now you have an uneven between slave and free states, and then any vote on slavery is going to go whichever way there are more states. So the Wilmot Proviso does not pass because this pro-slavery people are not going to go for that. Free Soil Party gets it into the national issue as a national issue. The California Gold Rush allows California to become a state. In 1849, the 49ers go out there. We've talked about that. It becomes a state in 1850. Now it's a free state, so it upsets the balance between the slave and free states. So if you have like 11 slave states and 11 slave states, everything's equal. It's all good. If you have 12 free states and 11 slave states, the free states have the upper hand. They can vote whatever they want. So some argued that California should be split into 2 states, Northern and Southern California, 1 free and 1 slave. In March of 1850, California applied to be admitted into the United States as a free state, and that would officially mean that the slave states would be outnumbered. This was never going to happen unless there was a compromise made. So in 1850, Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas crafted a plan to settle the problem. It's called the Compromise of 1850. The North would get California as a free state. Slave trade would be abolished in Washington, D.C., which was the capital, so you could not trade slaves within the capital of the United States. The southern states, the pro-slave states, would get an assurance that no law would be passed regarding slavery in the rest of the Mexican Cession. So what this means, if we look at this map that says Compromise of 1850, right here, Compromise of 1850 allowed California to be a slave state in exchange for much stricter Fugitive Slave Act. Slavery issue was not mentioned in the organization of Utah and New Mexico territories. So essentially what the Compromise of 1850 does is it gives California as a free state. Utah and New Mexico territory, basically you couldn't, the Congress of the United States couldn't say free or slave. The territories themselves had to say free or slave. They would decide. So they leave it up to them to decide which is really what the southern states want. The southern states want other new states to decide. They don't want it to be told to them. The other part of the Compromise of 1850 is the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act made it a crime to assist runaway slaves. So runaway slaves are escaping from the plantations, the cruel environment of slavery, and then they get to the north. And it's supposed to be a free area. Well, if you help them as a northerner, just try to help them hide them in your house or help them get to the next location or whatever, it would be a crime and you could be in trouble for that. Slave catchers were also hired, basically like bounty hunters. They were hired to roam the north, and sometimes they were looking for quote unquote runaway slaves, but a lot of times they would just capture random African Americans who were free and then ship them back into the South and make them slaves. So they would just capture people and force them into slavery, even though they were not actually runaway slaves. So the Southerners are okay with this law. Many Northerners just ignore it, though. So this is going to be something that really problems between the two areas. The Fugitive Slave Act leads to a person called Harriet Beecher Stowe writing a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is basically, the point of the book was to describe how terrible it was to be a slave. A lot of people in the North, I don't think understood what it was like to be a slave. They might have disagreed with slavery, but I don't think the vast majority of people understood how terrible it really was. the book became really popular in the North just because it really was it was very descriptive of what it was like to be in slavery, and just argued that it was immoral, like it was against Christian beliefs and all of this. The Southerners didn't like the book, obviously, because it made them look bad, but they said that it was a false picture of slavery. So being a slave wasn't really that bad, according to them. But Uncle Tom's Cabin really brings the issue of slavery into the light of day. So Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Fugitive Slave Act, and the Compromise of 1850 all lead to a very large increase in tensions. These tensions soon lead to violence. Senator Stephen Douglas proposes the Kansas-Nebraska Act to organize Kansas and the Nebraska territories. So if we look at this down here, Kansas-Nebraska Act. So we are building on the Compromise of 1850. We have Utah and New Mexico territory, and now we have Nebraska and Kansas territory. The Kansas-Nebraska Act basically said the Missouri Compromise was over. We're going to throw that out. And the act allowed slavery north of Missouri's southern border. And essentially what Stephen Douglas is trying to do here is say people within those territories should decide whether or not there is slavery there or not. The idea of popular sovereignty, which we have talked about as being part of the Constitution, this idea that the people rule, the people have the power. The Kansas-Nebraska Act passes Congress. It eliminates the Missouri Compromise, and this leads to basically, we call it Bleeding Kansas. It is essentially a mini civil war, because within the territory of Kansas on this map, not like the state of Kansas, within this whole territory of Kansas, you have two sides going at it in terms of actual violence and fighting. For 3 years, pro-slavery settlers from Missouri, so people that were pro-slavery, wanted slavery from Missouri and Kansas, went against abolitionists, people that were anti-slavery, and were led by John Brown. They fought over whether or not Kansas would be a free or slave state. Eventually, there's going to be a vote on whether or not Kansas should be free or slave. So what they want to do is each side wants to get the other side kicked out of Kansas, or they want to scare them enough to where they leave. And that's where the fighting comes in. Another terrible map. Okay, there are two territorial capitals. One, basically, so there's one capital that's for the slave people that support slave, and then that want slavery, and then one capital that are basically anti-slavery. So the pro-slavery supporters go into the abolitionist capital. So the pro-slavery people go into the people's capital who are against slavery, and they burn it down. The abolitionist who is against slavery, John Brown, he goes into the slavery place and he kills 5 slave supporters. So now there is actual violence going on in Kansas, actual fighting over the issue. And that's essentially why we call it Bleeding Kansas, and also why it's kind of a mini civil war. It's a preview to what is going to erupt on a national level. In Congress, when Senator Charles Sumner spoke out against the violence in Kansas, so basically he stands up and says, hey guys, I don't think it's probably very good that there are Americans fighting against each other. Maybe we should do something about this. Another senator, A.P. Butler, gets up and just starts to attack him and beat him with his cane until he is basically just unconscious and almost to the point of death. Charles Sumner is so badly hurt that he can't come to Senate. He can't be a senator. He can't come back for a long time, like months. And this isn't like a thing where everybody's like, oh man, that's really terrible, A.P. Butler. Like, you shouldn't have beat that guy almost to death with your cane. Pro-slavery people will cheer him and they're like, hey, way to go, dude. You really showed that guy. This really sparks the creation of the Republican Party. The Republican Party at its beginning is focused on ending slavery. They want to end slavery. They want to end the violence. They want to stop it from spreading anywhere else in the country. So this kind of really sets up how much tension there is amongst the different areas in the country and the different sections of the country. So that's what lesson one is really all about. It's just we have the North, we have the South, we have people compromising over things, but it's not really working out. And really that's it, guys. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them. If you have questions that you want to type out, go ahead, and I will try to answer them for you. But that's really it for lesson one. I would expect that we'll do this again for lesson two on maybe Friday. So just be looking for the announcement for that. So if you don't have any questions, you are good to go. You can head out. I appreciate you guys watching for a little bit. If you have a question or something, go ahead, stick around. But yeah, talk to you guys later. All right.